Mercedes and Red Bull may have already won the 2026 Formula One season before a single car has turned a wheel. Just weeks before the most dramatic regulation change in modern F1 history, a loophole in the engine rules has been exposed that could give these two manufacturers and their 6 combined customer teams a decisive advantage over everyone else on the grid. Ferrari, Honda, and Audi have launched formal complaints with the FIA, and there's talk of protests at the very first race. Did the FIA know about this loophole all along? And if rivals can't catch up until 2027, what does that mean for the sport we love? Stick around to the end, because the answer might surprise you. Before we get into the technical details of this loophole, we need to set the stage for why this matters so much right now. Lewis Hamilton, the 7-time world champion, announced his shock move from Mercedes to Ferrari on February 1st, 2024, walking away from the most successful driver-team partnership in Formula One history after more than a decade with the Silver Arrows. Many reasons factored into that decision, but one stands out when you look at the timing. Ferrari pitched him on their 2026 plans, laying out their master plan and showing him exactly what they had in store for the new regulations, and Hamilton bought in. He knew that while Ferrari have been inconsistent with their aerodynamic packages over the years, their power unit has either led the field or come very close to it. 2026 was supposed to be the Great Reset, with new aerodynamic regulations, new power unit rules, and a chance for the entire competitive order to get reshuffled. Hamilton bet on Ferrari being best positioned to capitalize on that reset. Here's the irony, though. Just weeks before that 2026 season begins, a controversy has emerged suggesting Mercedes, the team Hamilton left behind, may have found something that gives them a major advantage over Ferrari and everyone else not running a Mercedes or Red Bull engine. The controversy centers on Article C, 5.4.3 of the 2026 FIA technical regulations, which governs compression ratio in the new power units. For those unfamiliar with the term, compression ratio measures how much the air-fuel mixture inside an engine cylinder gets squeezed before ignition. Higher compression generally means more power and better efficiency, but it also creates more stress on components and can cause problems like engine knock. Under previous regulations, the maximum geometric compression ratio sat at 18:1, and for 2026, the FIA reduced that limit down to 16:1. Lower compression ratio means slightly less power from the internal combustion engine, offset by the massive increase in electrical power from the new MG UK system. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The regulation specifies that compression ratio measurement must be executed at ambient temperature, meaning when the FIA checks whether your engine complies with the 16:1 limit, they do it when the engine is cold and sitting in the garage, not when it's actually running. And that's exactly where Mercedes and Red Bull have allegedly found their opening. Both manufacturers have apparently designed their engines using materials or components that deliberately expand when heated to operating temperature. Think about what that means in practice. When the engine sits cold and the FIA measures it, everything falls within the legal 16:1 limit. But when that engine fires up and reaches operating temperature, certain components expand. The piston moves slightly closer to the cylinder head, and the effective compression ratio climbs back toward the old 18:1 limit. The precision involved here is remarkable. A piston with an 80mm diameter moving just half a millimeter closer to the cylinder top would shift the compression ratio from 16:1 back toward 18:1. Half a millimeter is thinner than 5 sheets of paper. The performance advantage from this trick could deliver around 10 kilowatts of additional power, translating to roughly 13 to 15 horsepower. That might not sound like much on paper, but in Formula One terms it means 3 to 4 tenths of a second per lap, depending on the circuit. Over a full race distance, that gap separates fighting for a podium from fighting for points. The legal argument here is fascinating, because it exposes a fundamental contradiction within the regulations themselves. Article C, 5.4.3, explicitly states the compression ratio measurement gets performed at ambient temperature, and Mercedes and Red Bull can point to that black and white text and say they comply completely. When the FIA measures their engines using the prescribed method, they pass. End of discussion. But Article C 1.5 states that cars must comply with the regulations in their entirety at all times during a competition. At all times. If the 16:1 limit applies during actual racing, an engine exceeding that limit while running could be considered illegal, regardless of what it measures when cold. That's the heart of this dispute. Is 16:1 a design specification that only needs to pass the prescribed test conditions? Or is it a performance limit that must hold whenever the engine operates? The FIA has acknowledged the ambiguity exists. Their official position is that the regulations clearly define the maximum compression ratio and the method for measuring it based on static conditions at ambient temperature. And that procedure hasn't changed despite the reduction in permitted ratio for 2026. They admit thermal expansion can influence dimensions at operating temperature, but the current rules don't require measurement under hot conditions. The governing body says they continuously review such matters to ensure fairness and clarity, and adjustments to regulations or measurement procedures can be considered for the future if necessary. Read between those lines carefully. The FIA is essentially saying, yes, we know thermal expansion happens, and no, the current rules don't account for it. They're not calling Mercedes and Red Bull cheaters, and they're not declaring the approach illegal. They're saying the rules as written simply don't address this situation. The German outlet Motorsport magazine first broke this story, reporting that Ferrari, Audi and Honda had lodged complaints with the FIA. Detailed investigative coverage followed on December 19th and December 23rd of 2025, with additional technical analysis filling in the gaps. French publication L'Equipe reported an emergency FIA meeting had been scheduled with all 5 2026 power unit manufacturers. The timing here cannot be overstated. March 1st, 2026 marks the engine homologation deadline, and once that date passes, manufacturers get locked into their current engine designs. Minor updates and refinements remain possible throughout the season, but any fundamental architecture changes would take months and likely wouldn't happen until the 2027 season begins. Put yourself in Ferrari's position, or Honda's, or Audi's. You've just discovered 2 of your competitors built their entire engine concept around a rules interpretation you never pursued, and you can't redesign your engine in a few weeks. Development time, testing, manufacturing, all of it takes far longer than the window that remains. You're stuck with what you've got. That's why the opposition coalition has taken the step of writing a formal joint letter to the FIA demanding clarification. Looking at the specific positions of teams who would benefit from the loophole, Mercedes has stayed quiet on the allegations directly. Toto Wolff has maintained his characteristic caution when discussing 2026 expectations, calling himself a notorious pessimist and saying the glass is always half empty rather than half full. He talks about setting targets on the power unit and chassis without knowing whether those targets were ambitious enough or whether they've missed some trick. Classic Wolff positioning right there, managing expectations, downplaying any advantage, leaving room to be pleasantly surprised. But here's the thing, Mercedes has apparently been in dialogue with the FIA throughout the entire rules process, and received reassurance that their interpretation aligns with the FIA's view. If accurate, Mercedes didn't hide this concept. They asked the governing body about it, and they got the green light. Paddock insiders suggest Mercedes has worked on this thermal expansion concept longer than Red Bull, and that brings up an interesting subplot. Red Bull Powertrains, the engine division Red Bull established when Honda initially planned to leave the sport, has also declined public comment. Italian reports allege that roughly 7 months ago, a Mercedes engineer hired by Red Bull Powertrains shared this concept with his new employer. Red Bull's 600-person engine division has recruited extensively from Mercedes high-performance powertrains over recent years, making that kind of knowledge transfer plausible, if awkward. The same reports claim Red Bull has so far failed to replicate the same effect Mercedes achieves. If true, Even among the two manufacturers allegedly exploiting this loophole, a significant performance gap could exist. Williams team principal James Vowles, whose team runs Mercedes engines and would benefit from any advantage they've found, pushed back against what he called a false narrative about Mercedes' 2026 dominance. He didn't address the loophole specifically, but his comments suggest at least some in the Mercedes camp believe the story has been blown out of proportion. On the other side of this dispute sits Ferrari team principal Fred Vasseur, who gave an interview on December 17th before the full controversy emerged publicly. His comments now look remarkably prescient. He said, "Teams have grown massively over the last year, meaning more and more people are trying to find loopholes. Good regulations that let someone build a faster car through good work seems fair enough to him. But when it comes to loopholes in the wording, that becomes much more difficult for everybody and much more dangerous for F1. That last phrase carries weight beyond competitive balance. Vasseur is talking about perception of fairness in the sport itself. When fans believe one team found a way to circumvent the intent of regulations through clever wordsmithing rather than pure engineering excellence, it undermines the entire premise of competition. Ferrari, Honda and Audi have formed what's being called an opposition coalition, writing that joint letter to the FIA. Ferrari has indicated they're prepared to file official protests at the Australian Grand Prix if the issue isn't resolved before the March 8th season opener. Picture what that would mean. The very first race of the new regulatory era, the grand unveiling of these revolutionary 2026 cars, developed over years, could get overshadowed by courtroom drama and technical protests. Formula One has seen this play out before, and it rarely ends well for anyone involved. This controversy has clear historical precedents, and understanding them helps predict how the current situation might unfold. The closest parallel comes from 2009, when Braun GP, Toyota, and Williams exploited a loophole in Article 3.12.7 that let them run a double-decker diffuser, generating far more downforce than their competitors. Teams who hadn't thought of it protested at the 2009 Australian Grand Prix, which should sound familiar by now. The FIA Court of Appeal declared it legal in April of that year, allowing it to continue through 2010 before getting banned for 2011. Performance gains from the double diffuser ran between 3 and 8/10 of a second per lap, depending on development level, which lines up almost exactly with estimates for the compression ratio loophole. Braun GP went from a team that nearly didn't exist to world champions that season. The loophole changed absolutely everything. Then, there's the DAS system Mercedes ran in 2020, which adjusted the toe angle of their front wheels while driving. The FIA ruled it legal for that season, but banned it for 2021. FIA single-seater director Nicolas Tombazis has cited this as precedent, noting Mercedes asked about DAS after developing it, and essentially took a calculated risk that paid off. Tombazis also issued a warning back in September 2025 that now looks remarkably on point. He said that if someone developed a concept based on a 50-50 ambiguous interpretation, it would be suicide for that team, and they would not tolerate anyone exploiting loopholes they've kept hidden. That warning raises an important question about whether Mercedes and Red Bull kept this hidden or asked the FIA about it in advance. Available evidence suggests Mercedes at least maintained dialogue with the FIA throughout development. If so, this looks more like DAS than deliberate deception. The ongoing flexi wings debate offers another parallel, where teams have repeatedly designed rear wings that pass static FIA tests, but flex significantly at high speed for aerodynamic advantage. That situation eventually led to dots being placed on rear wings, additional camera footage gathering data, and tighter tests. The pattern across all these cases runs similar. Teams find a rules interpretation giving them an advantage. Rivals protest. The FIA either validates the interpretation or changes rules to close the loophole. But teams that found the original advantage typically keep it for at least one season while competitors catch up. Looking at what happens next, we can map out the critical timeline. Pre-season testing runs January 26th through 30th, 2026 in Barcelona as a closed-door test, but teams will get their first real indication of where they stand relative to competition. If Mercedes and Red Bull cars run significantly faster than expected, it adds fuel to this controversy. March 1st, 2026 marks the engine homologation deadline, and after that date, fundamental architecture of each manufacturer's power unit gets locked in. Minor updates remain possible under the ADUO system, standing for additional development and upgrade opportunities, but wholesale redesigns become impossible. March 8th brings the season opener in Melbourne at the Australian Grand Prix, and if the loophole question hasn't been resolved by then, that's when Ferrari has indicated they may file formal protests. The 2009 double diffuser got protested at the same venue, creating uncomfortable symmetry. Catch-up mechanisms exist within the regulations for manufacturers falling behind. Engine suppliers running 2 to 4% behind the best power unit receive one additional upgrade opportunity, while those more than 4% behind receive 2. But the fundamental architecture changes required to replicate the thermal expansion concept would take many months, probably not realistic until the 2027 season starts. Reports suggest a compromise is being discussed that would permit Mercedes to use their thermal expansion system in 2026 only, with formal commitment to abandon it for 2027. Whether Ferrari and other complainants would accept such an arrangement remains unclear, but it would follow the template established by cases like DAS. Zooming out to consider broader competitive implications, if the loophole stands and provides the estimated advantage, 6 of 11 teams on the 2026 grid benefit from it. That's Mercedes, McLaren, Williams, and Alpine running Mercedes power units, plus Red Bull Racing and Racing Bulls with Red Bull powertrains engines. The opposition coalition consists of 5 teams. Ferrari and Haas run Ferrari power. Aston Martin uses Honda engines. Audi supplies what used to be Sauber, now running as the Audi Works team. And Cadillac, the new American entry, runs Ferrari power as well. More than half the grid could hold an engine advantage, the other half cannot replicate for at least a year, possibly longer. The 2026 regulations were specifically designed to bring manufacturers closer together, reducing performance gaps and creating more competitive racing. If this loophole tilts the playing field before the first race happens, it undermines that entire goal. There's also the question of what this means for Lewis Hamilton personally. He left Mercedes partly because he believed Ferrari was better positioned for 2026 regulations. If Mercedes has found an engine advantage Ferrari doesn't have, Hamilton might watch his former team succeed with a power unit his new team suddenly sits at a disadvantage against. Hamilton has already expressed some ambivalence about the 2026 regulations. After the Las Vegas Grand Prix in 2025, he said he wasn't looking forward to F1 2026, though he later clarified that comment came in the heat of frustration, and he's actually excited to see what Ferrari builds for next year. When asked if he was glad to see the back of the current ground effect cars used since 2022, his answer was simply yes. Excitement about new regulations is one thing. Discovering your new team might already be behind before the season starts is something else entirely. Something worth addressing that's been discussed in the paddock but hasn't been widely reported is the possibility this entire controversy has been somewhat exaggerated. James Vowles has used the phrase false narrative when discussing reports about Mercedes' 2026 dominance. He didn't elaborate extensively, but his comments suggest at least some people within Mercedes-powered teams believe the situation isn't as dramatic as portrayed. Questions also remain about whether the thermal expansion concept actually works as well in practice as it does in theory. Engine development involves countless trade-offs, and a design choice increasing compression ratio might create problems elsewhere with reliability, heat management, or integration with other components. Till these engines actually run in anger on a racetrack, nobody outside the factory knows for certain what advantage they provide. The FIA's own position deserves consideration too. While they've acknowledged ambiguity in the regulations, they haven't declared the Mercedes and Red Bull approach illegal. haven't announced emergency rule changes, and have essentially said the rules are what they are, with possible adjustments for the future if necessary. That's a notably restrained response, if they believed two major manufacturers were fundamentally circumventing regulatory intent. Two interpretations exist for what's happening here. One says Mercedes and Red Bull have genuinely found a significant loophole, delivering decisive advantage, making Ferrari, Honda, and Audi right to be concerned. The other interpretation says this is partly Paddock politics, with teams positioning themselves to create pressure for beneficial rule changes while waging a PR battle ahead of a season where competitive positions remain unknown. Truth probably lands somewhere in between. The loophole appears real. The performance advantage appears meaningful. But whether it's truly decisive, whether it holds up throughout an entire season of development, and whether the FIA might still intervene to level the playing field, all of that remains to be seen. Approaching the conclusion of this story, we need to come back to the fundamental questions at stake. Formula One has always existed in tension between two competing values. On one hand, the sport celebrates engineering ingenuity, the ability to find solutions others haven't thought of, pushing boundaries of what's possible within given rules. On the other hand, the sport depends on perception of fair competition, the idea that results come from quality of cars and drivers, rather than who found better lawyers to interpret ambiguous regulations. The 2009 double diffuser was brilliant engineering, but it was deeply controversial and shaped competitive order for 2 full seasons before getting banned. The Mercedes DAS system showed innovative thinking that was ultimately deemed too far outside the spirit of rules, even while being technically legal. The compression ratio loophole falls into that same grey area. Mercedes and Red Bull appear to have found a legitimate interpretation of poorly written rules, and they may have even consulted with the FIA before committing to their designs. From their perspective, they did everything right. From Ferrari's perspective, though, and Honda's and Audi's, the outcome feels unfair. They played by what they understood the rules to mean, and now they're being told a different interpretation might have been smarter. They can't catch up quickly. Their only recourse is protesting, lobbying the FIA, trying to change the narrative in hopes the governing body intervenes. And fans are left wondering whether the racing they'll watch in 2026 will be genuine competition or a foregone conclusion determined by a few words in a technical document. What makes Formula One compelling is that combination of human skill and mechanical excellence, the best drivers in the world pushing the most advanced racing machines to absolute limits. When that equation stays balanced, results can be extraordinary. When it becomes imbalanced, when one team or group of teams holds an advantage others can't match, the spectacle suffers. The 2026 regulations were supposed to create a more level playing field. Removing the MGU-H was meant to make engine design simpler and more accessible to new manufacturers. Cost caps were meant to prevent richest teams from simply outspending everyone else. New aerodynamic rules were designed to let cars follow each other more closely and produce better racing. If the first season of these new regulations gets defined by an engine loophole, splitting the grid in half, it will be a profound disappointment. Not because Mercedes and Red Bull necessarily did anything wrong, but because the promise of a new era will have been undermined before it began. The next few weeks will be decisive. The FIA meeting with all 5 power unit manufacturers will either produce resolution or deepen the conflict. The homologation deadline will pass, locking in whatever designs currently exist, and on March 8th in Melbourne, the cars will finally take to the track for the first race of the 2026 season. By then, we'll know whether this controversy was a genuine crisis or pre-season noise that faded once racing began. We'll know whether Ferrari files those protests, and if they do, how the FIA responds. We'll know whether the performance gap matches the estimates, or whether reality proves more nuanced. What we already know is this: Formula One never lacks for drama, even when the cars aren't on track. The 2026 season is shaping up to be one of the most consequential in the sport's history, and it hasn't even started yet. Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown useful, consider subscribing for more deep dives into Formula One's technical and political battles. The 2026 season is going to be fascinating, and we'll be covering every twist and turn as it unfolds.